Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another of our 2017 SPED Ahead Professional Development webinars. My name is Katie Povatial, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of Presence Learning, the sponsor of this program. Presence Learning provides live online therapy and diagnostic services to thousands of schools and students. We got amazing feedback and comments after the first webinar in this series with Dr. Howie Knopf. Howie delivered what seemed like a condensed graduate-level course on how to build effective social, emotional, and behavioral skills programs for our schools. His presentation was followed by an engaging question and answer session with many great questions submitted by you in our audience. If you were not able to attend, or if you were with us and want to continue your study of the vast amount of information that Howie presented, it's available now, on demand, in the archives, on the Presence Learning website. Please watch it or rewatch it and share it with your colleagues. Today's webinar, the second in our fall series lineup, features a well-known expert on reading interventions and how to make them really work, Dr. Jeannie Wansek. Next month, we'll wrap up this Blueprints for Success series with Dr. Carol Tomlinson, a rock star as a coach and chief architect of differentiated instruction. Carol's words of wisdom and success stories have had a huge positive impact on teachers and school administrators around the world. So we are absolutely thrilled to have her join our faculty. I encourage you to alert everyone you know to register for this one because Carol's message is one that we all need to listen to and use as a foundation for academic achievement. What a great way to get ready for the holiday season and prepare us for the all-important start of the second semester of the academic year. We all know how important literacy is to the success of our students. And for students with special needs, learning to read and communicate can be especially challenging. And if students who struggle with literacy don't get the help they need, the impact can be devastating. Research has continued to reveal successful approaches and blueprints for different situations, but the range of choices and the challenge of implementation can be daunting for sure. So, to share the latest insight on this all-important topic, let me introduce you to Dr. Jeannie Wansek. Jeannie is the Curry Ingram Endowed Chair and Associate Professor in the Department of Special Education at Vanderbilt University Peabody College. Her research focuses on understanding what makes for effective reading instruction and intervention, especially prevention of and remediation for students with reading difficulties and disabilities. Prior to receiving her doctorate, Jeannie worked as a special educator and as an elementary teacher. She has a number of publications as well as national and international presentations in the areas of early reading, learning disability, response to intervention, and adolescent reading intervention. Currently, Dr. Wansek is implementing 2 federally funded grant projects related to reading intervention. Jeannie, welcome. It's all yours.
Thank you for the introduction. I'd also like to thank Presence Learning for making this webinar possible. Today I'm going to share an architecture for intensifying elementary reading interventions for students who are not responding to typical evidence-based interventions. As you know, students with disabilities often need these more intensive interventions given the severity of the difficulties they may experience with learning to read. I will discuss several concepts for intensifying interventions. And there will be a resource handout that you will receive with any sources of information that I also mentioned today. In an RTI or MTSS system, it is important first to consider the differences when planning instruction for the different levels of intervention. In particular, core reading instruction in the elementary grades, as we all know, is designed for all students to make 1 year's gain in the curriculum. It covers all the grade level standards, major and minor, and is generally set at an average progression level. Of course, as Carol Tomlinson will talk about later in our series, there is a need to differentiate instruction in the core, given the varying actual starting points of the students that we teach. However, the general premise of the materials and instruction in the core is different than reading intervention, in its focus on all the grade level standards for a given grade. In reading intervention, it is important that the materials used and the instruction implemented is designed to allow acceleration of student achievement, designed specifically to allow a student to make more than 1 year gain. Interventions for students who are not currently on grade level, and we do not want them to make only 1 year's gain, keeping the same gap between performance and grade level expectations, Rather, they need to gain key skills to accelerate their learning, close the gap, and gain the knowledge needed to better access the core reading instruction. So a starting point for an evidence-based reading intervention is to ensure that the materials or the program of instruction being implemented is designed to accelerate learning and is not just a leftover core curriculum being implemented as an intervention. Today we're going to focus on the construct of reading intervention for students with significant reading difficulties or disabilities, those who need the most intensive interventions. You are probably already familiar with the Institute of Education Sciences Response to Intervention Guidebook for the elementary grades. In that, Tier 2 instruction is defined as a fairly standardized supplemental small group reading instruction that addresses the major components of reading. Probably no surprise to anyone in the audience. Many students will accelerate their learning, close the gap, and succeed in their core reading instruction after receiving Tier 2 level instruction. However, many students with more severe needs, of course, require something more intensive. Gerson and colleagues defined a more intensive Tier 3 intervention as providing focused, more targeted, extended instruction. In our current practice in the schools, intensive interventions are the most commonly missing, even though some students require these interventions. Today we're going to focus on 3 ways to increase intensity of reading intervention for students who do not make sufficient progress after a reasonable amount of time in a less intensive Tier 2 intervention. There are basically 3 ways to increase the intensity of reading interventions for students with significant reading difficulties or disabilities: scheduling or organizational changes, content level considerations, and instructional delivery modifications. We will discuss each of these in a bit more detail today. First, let's briefly talk about ways to intensify through organizational changes. These are the most commonly used and are also often referred to as quantitative changes to intervention in a data-based individualization model or a DBI model. Many of you are probably familiar with these types of changes, so we'll spend just a brief amount of time on them. There are 2 parts to thinking about intensifying intervention organizationally: time and grouping. These organizational considerations are the most basic aspects of intensification. They're the most used in current practice and the most familiar to administrators and teachers. These organizational considerations can be used in combination with the content and the delivery considerations that we'll discuss later. Let's talk about additional learning time. More time in targeted instruction will increase the intensity of an intervention and can accelerate learning. Learning time can be increased through either an increase in the length of instructional sessions, for example, increasing an intervention from 30 minutes to 45 minutes, or an increase in the frequency of instructional sessions, for example, increasing an intervention from 3 times a week to 5 times a week, or in some upper elementary research, increases have been made from having 1 session daily to 2 intervention sessions daily. Intervention can also be intensified by increasing the duration of the intervention, so a student spends more weeks in intervention. Typically, an intervention that is increased in duration also needs to be intensified in other ways. Otherwise, it's likely that instruction is just being slowed down for the student, making it difficult for them to accelerate their learning. So you would include either increasing the length or frequency or other aspects of the content or delivery that we're going to discuss along with the duration of the intervention increase. How this additional time is used is what is the most important. If you just do the same lesson in more time, it's unlikely to increase intensity or accelerate learning. To actually accelerate learning, you need to use the additional time for more instruction, more deliberate practice with feedback, or for delivering more explicit systematic instruction to assist students in mastering the concepts. A second organizational way to intensify intervention is to use smaller targeted groups. Again, it's important you have a purpose for the smaller group that will increase the student learning with that smaller group. For example, is the smaller group allowing for more individualized instruction? Is the smaller group allowing for more practice opportunities to master more efficiently the tasks? Or is the smaller group allowing for more feedback to increase the success for the student? Although the research indicates that decreasing group size can accelerate student learning, there is no ideal intervention group size. Small groups of 2 to 4 students, or sometimes one-on-one, are typically seen for more intensive Tier 3 type interventions in the research. It's most important that the smaller group size be used to administer carefully designed instruction that is based on student data and progress in order to actually accelerate the student's learning. Okay, so we've covered the basic organizational intensifications that it can increase student learning, providing additional time in instruction and decreasing the size of the instructional group. Again, elements that most of you are probably already familiar with. A second area to consider when students are continuing to struggle in an intervention and need more intensive intervention is the content and the extent to which that is meeting student needs, particularly in terms of what is emphasized. When we are considering content, we will look first at the student needs based on our assessments, and within these needs, we will consider what needs are not currently being addressed adequately through the current intervention. This could be because the need is not actually being addressed in the current intervention, or it could be that the need is not being addressed adequately for a particular student. For example, a student may need intervention in reading fluency, but the current intervention that is sufficient for many students does not devote enough time and practice to reading text and fluency for a particular individual student. As we go through this, consider the intensive interventions that are in place in your schools and the extent to which content considerations are used. So here we have our 5 components of reading. And just to be sure that we're all on the same page, when we talk about that bottom one, phonemic awareness, sometimes called phonological awareness, is an oral activity that deals with students manipulating and hearing sounds in words. So they can understand that the word mat has the sounds at. There's no print involved. They don't know that the letters are M, A, and T. It's just an oral manipulation of hearing sounds. Phonics and word recognition, of course, gets into the print. This is the letter sounds and how we use sounds to read words, but also deals with irregular words and spelling too. Fluency and fluent reading, obviously, is the student being able to do those tests and read text in a fluent and automatic way, sounding like they are talking. Helps with comprehension. Vocabulary, we're talking about the meanings of words and what words they not only can read, but understand what they mean. And reading comprehension or listening comprehension, dealing with understanding the concepts of what is being read to them or what they are actually reading. There are 2 areas in this content that need to be considered specifically for reading intervention. First, what skills do the students need now and what is coming up? We want to target these. With elementary students, particularly in the early grades, it may be that students only need intervention in a particular area, perhaps just in phonics. But you also want to think ahead a bit for them too, so that you're not putting them in an intervention, having them get on track, exiting them from the intervention, and then right away they need intervention. Second, we want to think about high impact skills. There are critical skills in each of these areas that have the highest impact on students' reading progress, and that's where we want to focus in intervention. Let's talk more about that. High impact skills are the practices that make the highest contribution to learning to read and can accelerate learning, which is the goal of intervention for students who are struggling. In the entire core reading instruction, all of the skills and strategies that are part of the grade level standards must be covered. In intervention, we are focused on the highest impact skills and strategies that will help students with or at risk for reading disabilities to better access the core instruction. Intervention seeks to accelerate learning. Let's look at an example of that. We're going to take phonological awareness. Phonological awareness is one component of reading that a student may need instruction. You see here a list of skills that are a part of phonological awareness. However, while all of these skills may be a part of a core kindergarten curriculum, they are not all equally important. The skills on this slide are generally speaking in order from least difficult to most difficult, and to some extent from least important to most important, with a few caveats. So we start with rhyming, and certainly rhyming can be a part of a core curriculum, asking students what word rhymes with mat, or name a word that rhymes with mat. We also have comparison, matching, and discrimination, and that is when students just have to pick out a similar or different word. So I might ask students, what word sounds different in these words? Cat, mat, pain. And they would discriminate that pain sounds a little different than cat and mat. Then we move on to a little harder skill, which is isolation. Isolation is when you ask a student to isolate or say this particular sound in a word. So what is the last sound in cat? It is t. Or what is the first sound in cat? K. They're isolating that sound. Typically done with one-syllable words. Then we move on to blending. And blending is where you would hear sounds and then be able to tell what word it is. So I might say to a student, what word is cat? And they know that it's cat. Just, again, no print involved. They are just hearing the sounds. Segmenting is the opposite of blending, and that is where the child would come up with the sounds. So I'd give the word cat and ask the child to tell me what sounds are in cat. K, at, and they actually say those sounds. So again, they can hear the individual sounds in the word. Again, no print. They don't know that that's a C, an A, and a T necessarily. They just hear those sounds. Deletion is a little harder skill, and that is when you would ask a child, what word is left after I take a sound out? What is cat if we remove k, and the word is at after you take off the k sound? Substitution then adds another letter back in to make another new word. So if we take off the k in at and put in p, what word do we get? Pat. Obviously, a much more difficult skill and requires some memory as well because they have to hold a lot of sounds and words in their memory as they do that. We know from research that the ability to blend and segment phonemes in words is the most related to future reading outcomes, and that's why those two are green on there. That's the highest impact skills for phonological awareness. Other phonological skills, like rhyming or saying the first sound of a word, may be pre-skills or scaffolds for students that are necessary in order for them to eventually learn blending and segmenting. But if the students don't get to the blending and segmenting, and there isn't an emphasis in this area, it won't have the largest possible impact on their reading. We can work on rhyming for as long as we want, but it's not going to have a very high impact on students' reading. Instead, we want to use rhyming as a pre-skill to help us get to the blending and segmenting. These are the priorities in the intervention. So if I have a student with a need in phonological awareness, I would focus on blending and segmenting and use the early skills only if needed in intervention. For example, if I have a student that can't hear all the sounds in a word and isn't able yet to work on blending or segmenting, I might do isolation. But if the student is able to work on blending or segmenting, I'm not going to work on all of these skills during the intervention. I'm going to focus on the highest impact. Similarly, I know that deletion and substitution are generally more difficult skills, but there is no evidence that you get better at your reading by also mastering these skills. So if you've mastered blending and segmenting, you've done the work that's most related to your reading. Once the student has mastered blending and segmenting, I'm going to move on to other reading practices and not spend time in the intervention on deletion and substitution. Similarly, in phonological awareness, there are different units of sound that students can work on within each of those previous skills that we just went over. These are again in order, generally speaking, from least difficult to most difficult. So a student who really struggles in phonological awareness may even be starting with whole words. So they might segment a sentence just into words, telling what words are in that sentence. Again, all oral, not with print. Some students might start with compound words. What does baseball make? I can blend that to make baseball. More advanced is syllables. What syllables do I hear in quotation? Quotation. And then getting even more advanced, starts to get to some individual sounds, is the onset rhyme. An onset is the consonant or consonants before a vowel in a single syllable word, and the rhyme is the vowel and after. For example, in cat, the k is the onset, and at is the rhyme. So it goes beyond the syllable. We're only using single syllable words. They have to isolate some individual sounds like the k sound, but can keep others together like the rhyme and the at. Or in a more tricky word, the word blend, The onset is bowl, and the rhyme is end, the vowel N after. So it can ask students, what word is bowl end? And they have to put that together into blend. A little more difficult than syllables or compound words, but not quite as difficult as the last one, which is the phoneme, and that's the individual sounds. Phoneme is just another word for sound. The individual sounds that I was using as examples in the previous slide. That's when you're saying k, at, are the sounds in cat. And you notice again that phoneme is green. Once again, there's one particular unit that is the most related to students' reading achievement. That's the highest impact. And that, in this case, is the phoneme or the sound for phonological awareness. The other units can be used for scaffolding for students that aren't ready to work on the phoneme level. But if students are ready for the phoneme, even if they haven't done syllables yet, I will work on the phoneme level with them. That's how we're going to accelerate learning. This is what will help them best access other aspects of their core curriculum where all of these aspects are probably being covered. All right, we can do similar applications to each of the other reading components as well. I'm going to share with you examples of high-impact skills for reading intervention within these components, just kind of across all grade levels to address our multi-level audience. But you can get the idea from these examples and do the same thing specifically within a grade level. So these are just examples. Examples of high-impact skills in phonics and word recognition over time include teaching letter sounds. And by that I mean at all levels. The easiest level is individual letter sounds, so what sound does S make, for example, but also advancing to letter combinations, like SH says sh or EA says E, and for more advanced students, affixes that they can apply in multisyllabic words, so un in undo, or re in redo, or shun in quotation. Phonics and word recognition critical skills also include then really explicit instruction in using those sounds to blend and read words. So now we know these sounds, we may even know them automatically and fluently. How do we use that to read more and more words? In addition, because the English language is not all regular, some pretty specific instruction in irregular words can help to accelerate learning and is a high impact skill. It requires a lot of review as well. And then for more advanced students, one aspect of phonics and word recognition that has a very high impact but is often missing from instruction and intervention is teaching students a strategy to actually read multisyllabic words. That is different from blending and reading words because in those larger words, you actually don't want to blend each individual sound. They're just too long for that. They need a different type of strategy. And towards the end of this webinar, we'll be looking at an example lesson to intensify, and one of the examples actually has a strategy for multisyllabic word reading. This allows students to know how to identify larger words in text. And another high impact area for phonics and word recognition is to integrate spelling and reading of words together as they're learning these sounds or as they're learning their irregular words. It's important for students to be able to use the sounds back and forth in print from reading to spelling. We know kids who can do that have a stronger grasp of print language. They see a word and they know how to read it. They hear a word and they can picture how to spell it. Finally, phonics and word recognition must be applied to text reading. So we need to do this work and get fluent at all of these individual areas, but they have to see how that applies to text reading to have the highest impact. High impact skills in reading fluency include giving students many opportunities to read text. That should be happening daily, not only in the core, but particularly in intervention. Repeated reading of text to improve fluency, so trying to get more fluent with each reading of the text. Modeling of fluent reading with opportunities for the students to then sound like the model. So the teacher models and then the students get a chance to read the same passage sounding like that model. And most importantly with each of those, having a specific goal for improving reading fluency in the activities that are used. Students need to know that the reason they're rereading a text is to increase their fluency, to sound like they are talking, for example, or to decrease their errors. Without a goal, they will not understand the purpose of the activity. They may go off and reread or listen to the model, but they don't know what they're listening for, and they may simply read it the way that they have been reading it before without improving their fluency. So a goal is a really high impact aspect of fluency instruction. Examples of high-impact skills in vocabulary include directly teaching the meaning of useful, sophisticated words that are often used in text or just in academic language, and using research-based means that go beyond just definitions to teach those words. We know that teaching definitions or memorizing definitions is the least useful way to actually learn a word and to have it become part of your language. Instead, if we want high impact in vocabulary learning and instruction, we want to use examples and non-examples that bring clarity to the meaning of the word and the use of the word. Having students use the words as they learn them in meaningful ways through questioning, problem solving, application, and importantly, making connections between related words that they either already know or that they've recently learned so that they can categorize those together instead of learning every word separately. That will help with the efficiency of their vocabulary learning. Vocabulary also needs to be repeated and reviewed frequently with those types of activities so that they can continue to remember that word and use it more and more, both in their reading and in their own language. Examples of high-impact skills in comprehension include providing actual instruction in how to understand or comprehend both narrative and informational text, and those can be different, so they need instruction in both, rather than only checking comprehension through questioning. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the webinar too, but essentially students need to have the how to comprehend, not just be practicing answering questions. Building student background knowledge is also a high-impact area, not just activating the knowledge that they already have, but really giving new knowledge and building that background knowledge. That can have a high impact on their learning. Teaching students a strategy for how to identify important aspects of text. For example, giving them strategies for identifying the main idea and teaching them how to do that, or how to summarize a text with its main ideas. And teaching students to monitor their comprehension through self-questioning. Teaching them how to generate questions is a high-impact area and check their understanding as they read. These are key skills that can make a big difference in a student's understanding of text. These are just general examples across grade levels in each of the areas that an intervention might be covering. The important point is to consider what will have the highest impact in a student's reading achievement, rather than trying to teach everything that is taught in the core. All right. When a student is not progressing and you've considered content reasons for that, so you've considered targeting their specific content needs that we talked about and keeping your eye on the prize with high impact skills, the delivery of instruction is usually the area most in need of change to see acceleration in learning. One key aspect of intensifying through delivery of instruction is to consider the actual instruction that a student is receiving in an area of need. This sounds obvious, but sometimes a student is struggling because they are mainly receiving only practice or assessment in the area and haven't actually received sufficient instruction for them. For example, in the area of reading comprehension, as I mentioned before, monitoring comprehension is a high-impact area. However, the most common practices for teaching monitoring comprehension are to ask students questions. This is a valuable practice, but on its own, it sets up a situation where the student hasn't been taught how to monitor their comprehension, because essentially the teacher is checking the understanding of the student by asking these questions, but they haven't necessarily received instruction in how to do better with answering those questions. To accelerate this student's learning, we probably need to teach or instruct them in how to ask or answer those questions, not just practice answering them. What really is instruction? Well, if you look at the definition of instruction, you'll find something similar to this. Detailed information telling how something should be done, operated, or assembled. The how is a key aspect of instruction. As teachers, when a student is struggling, we need to consider whether our instruction actually provided them with detailed information in how to do something, or whether we just asked them to practice that something without telling them how to do it cognitively. Instruction is needed whenever a student is learning new knowledge to make it the most efficient learning and to be able to accelerate that learning. Okay, once we have both instruction and practice adequately in place, so we'll check that instructional piece first because that's an easy way to intensify intervention. There are also 4 key areas to consider in intensifying the delivery of an intervention. In research, the biggest difference between students who make significant progress and students who continue to fall behind is skilled use of these delivery components. These components are areas that all of us have heard about before and have a general idea about usually, but there really is a skill to using them in a dynamic way, and that is usually the difference between just kind of general intervention and a much more intensive intervention to help students accelerate their learning. First, we have explicit instruction. This is the process of overtly teaching each step to complete a task or thought process through teacher modeling and the use of many examples. And that goes hand in hand with the second one, which is systematic instruction. That first one, explicit instruction, is very much about the modeling. It may be even the amount of modeling that is making a difference in an intensive intervention for an individual student, but really making that process overt, telling them what it is that you think about while you're doing this task, showing them each step of it. But it goes hand in hand with systematic instruction, which is the process of breaking tasks down into manageable steps. And those steps then progress from simple to more complex to allow students to gradually gain the needed knowledge and master it efficiently, which essentially accelerates their learning because they're successful with each of those steps. The question is, what is manageable? How do you know if you have manageable steps? How do you know if you've broken it down far enough? And that can be different for different students and is the reason why these elements are dynamic and they're targeted for an individual student or a group of students who have similar needs. That's why they're a part of intensifying interventions. A good rule of thumb to use is if instruction is explicit and systematic enough to meet student needs, they will be able to be about 80% correct on their initial attempts at practice with a particular step or question or whatever they're initially being asked to do. If students are much lower than that, then they are frustrated and having too many incorrect practice attempts, which can prove confusing and can really slow down learning, also requires a lot of reteaching, which can also be confusing to students. You really want to hit that 80% correct mark. Third is ample practice and ensuring students have many opportunities to respond and practice with and without support during the learning. Many students are just not getting enough time to practice. They need more than your typical intervention student, and that is why you have to intensify the intervention with that practice. And going hand in hand with that is incorporating sufficient amounts of immediate feedback during initial instruction and practice so that students can master the right way to complete a task and aren't practicing things incorrectly several times before receiving that feedback. We're going to delve a little bit deeper into each of these and look at some of the examples. Research has associated interventions incorporating explicit instruction with improved outcomes for students with learning difficulties for both basic skills, which might be the more obvious, and for higher level concepts. You can do this explicit instruction and show students the step-by-step manner in doing it with both types of skills and strategies that might be taught in reading. Explicit instruction is warranted during initial instruction of new content and when teaching students to generalize known content to new situations. As we've discussed, the key to explicit instruction is showing students how to do it and to make any thinking needed overt for the students so that they can begin to learn what to think about to complete the task. There's no guessing involved, and that's how we accelerate and more efficiently help students acquire the tasks and strategies and skills that they need. Systematic instruction, then, is also associated with the increased learning outcomes for students with learning difficulties. There's a meta-analysis, actually, based on 38 studies of systematic phonics instruction that progressed from smaller to larger units and was sequenced from easier to more difficult sounds and word types was more effective in increasing word reading than less systematic instruction. Really building from those high-impact skills of knowing the sounds, knowing how to use those to read words, knowing how to read those words along with irregular words in text. That systematic building and systematic becoming knowledgeable and fluent with each step of that helps a student learn how to read more quickly. Across content areas, instruction with the highest outcomes for students provide explicit and systematic instruction together. And steps toward complex reading practices should really be built gradually and include a high level of student engagement and interaction to ensure that students are adequately grasping and understanding the concepts and tasks. So if we break it down into steps, you can check on that student learning at each step, which also allows them to start practicing much sooner. In summary, effective instruction for new content or knowledge should be delivered in a systematic, highly explicit, and highly interactive way. In intensifying intervention, it is adjusting the explicitness, systematicness, and the support or scaffolds to meet specific student needs that can help to accelerate learning. Let's look at one brief example of making a lesson more explicit and systematic. We will examine some more complex lessons later when we'll apply all of the delivery aspects, but this will give us a quick example of just the explicit and systematic instruction areas. Here you see the initial lesson on teaching VCE words, or words with the silent E, they're sometimes called. This may be a grade level lesson for first grade, or it may be a lesson an upper elementary teacher is providing for students who have not mastered this concept yet. In this initial lesson, and this is just part of the materials that are part of the intervention program, the teacher would tell the students that words with an E at the end have the long vowel sound. And of course, a prerequisite is that they know the long vowel sounds. The teacher does a model, so there's already some explicitness in the program and in the instruction. They use the word make, and so the teacher explains that this is the word, make. It has an E at the end, and so it has the long sound A because of that E, and that word is ache, make, and the E is silent. And then they practice with some more words that have E, and the teacher reminds the student of the rule, which is that if it has that E, to say the long vowel sound. And for many students, that amount of explicitness may be all that they need to be successful with learning that new type of word. For some students who might need more intensive instruction, that would not be explicit or systematic enough. They would not reach that rule of thumb of generally understanding at an 80% level with that step number 3 where they first had to read the words. We can modify this lesson to make it more explicit and more systematic, and here's an example of one way to modify the lesson. Here, the teacher is making the rule more explicit. That really was in that initial lesson, but it was somewhat implicit. And then actually teaching each step of that rule one at a time in order to help students become fluent and accurate at that. That includes actually teaching the rule so that the students will be able to use it on their own. You'll see that making sure that the students understand which letters are the vowels. And then there's a step where the students are just learning the rule, and they've made it a rule that can be used with the same wording each time that they are initially practicing this. So an E at the end of a word tells us to say the first vowel's name, or you can say the long sound depending on what instruction they've had. And then the teacher does models going through that rule. First, I'm going to check if it has an E at the end, because that's the first part of the rule. Then I'll know, based on whether it has an E at the end, what vowel I say. If it has an E at the end, I'll say the first vowel's name, and then I can blend it and say the word. With the word make, we'd say, does it have an E at the end? Yes, it has an E at the end, so what do we know that we say? We say a, ache, make. Look at the next word, does it have an E at the end? No, we just read it our regular way, at, mat, and do this with several words to practice. This lesson has broken the task into smaller steps and provided more explicit instruction in doing each step. For a student that needed this instruction, they will actually learn more quickly and efficiently with this process than if we had to repeatedly try to reteach the previous lesson due to it not being explicit enough for a particular student. Thus, their instruction is not slower, but rather more tailored to allow accelerated learning. All right, let's move on to opportunities to practice and then the feedback aspect. Students with learning difficulties need frequent opportunities to respond and practice with teacher feedback throughout the lessons in order to accelerate their learning. This is another aspect that can be adapted in order to intensify a lesson. These practices can also increase engagement during instruction and improve student outcomes, not only because they've got the more practice and more accurate feedback and quick feedback, but also because they're more engaged. Frequent student response can assist the teacher in monitoring student understanding, and teacher feedback during student practice can be a powerful tool for refining and mastering new skills. In fact, it's an area that we have some of the greatest research in. Feedback prompts students to continue their successful attempts during practice or to remedy errors before they become entrenched. Past and recent syntheses of the research with hundreds of studies of student achievement report that feedback is one of the top influences on student outcomes. For our students, we of course want to make any of the changes necessary to accelerate learning, but if you were going to focus on one thing initially, it would definitely be to improve feedback and the timing of feedback. Feedback is most effective when it relates to student goals and provides information on how to complete tasks more effectively. This type of feedback is known as process-directed feedback. Researchers have noted lower effects for feedback that just involves praise or rewards or punishment. Feedback is more effective when it is given during or immediately after a task is completed. You want to provide feedback immediately for discrete tasks, for example, spelling a word, and after a short delay for more complex tasks like writing a paragraph, which allows the students to think through the process first before receiving the feedback. However, delaying feedback beyond the instructional session is less valuable to students. For example, providing feedback right after a student answers a question or completes a task is more likely to yield future correct responses for a student with learning difficulties than waiting until after the lesson. When there is a significant delay between the student's response and the teacher's feedback, the student may not be able to associate the feedback with the response or the thought process that they have. In addition, that student may have already practiced that task incorrectly several times before getting the feedback, which is problematic. Teachers need to use timely feedback to prevent inaccurate practice, increase the rate of student mastery. The more you're doing things correctly, the easier you will learn things, and to ensure successful, efficient learning. All right, before we examine some more complex lessons and ways to adapt and intensify those lessons to meet student needs, let's talk about one additional area of delivery of instruction, and that is supporting cognitive processing during intervention. Some students have difficulties with executive functioning, self-regulation, and an array of cognitive processes that can affect and influence their memory, their attention to the task, and the generation, selection, their own monitoring, or implementation of learning strategies. So they may understand what is being taught and the strategy, but they have trouble implementing it due to some of these cognitive processing difficulties. One can conceptualize these as the control processes that manage goal direction for learning, and they overlap with other cognitive and behavioral processes such as language, short-term memory, your processing speed, and your nonverbal reasoning. Although some students can struggle in these areas, the research does not actually support the notion that practitioners can identify these disorders, so you wouldn't specifically say, oh, they're having a problem with selection or implementation of the learning strategy. And more importantly, the research does not support that you can treat these in isolation. In isolation, you would not treat a working memory problem, for example, or if you do, you might improve it in isolation, but it will not help their reading or other academic areas. Treatments provided independently of academic learning have not improved academic outcomes, but rather we can attend to some of these areas within the academic intervention to help with the acceleration of learning in that academic area, in our case, reading. Let's talk about a few of those. Self-regulation instruction can be better integrated within academic learning and their use in reading. First, teachers can make their thinking visible to students, and that fits right in with the explicit instruction we've been talking about. They can use think-alouds to demonstrate how they approach problems, how they reflect on text, how they answer questions, how they give themselves feedback. A teacher may say, for example, before I read this text, I see that it will be difficult to understand. It looks complex. It looks difficult to me. First, I'm going to look for key words. I see 3 words in bold that I don't know, so I'm going to write those down to see if I can figure out what they mean as I'm reading the text. I'm going to really focus on those. Second, I'm going to look at the title and the headings and the questions at the end of the text, and that will help me. I'm going to think about what this text is about, and I'm going to try to make connections between the different headings as I'm reading. Third, while I read, I stop to see whether I've learned any information to help me answer the questions that I saw at the end of the text, and that will help me see if I'm thinking about the important parts of the text. Teachers must regularly monitor students in using these types of strategies, particularly independently. If you notice that students are struggling, or if your teachers notice that students are struggling, you want to determine what strategies they are using to complete the task and to understand the text, and then correction can be made there. Feedback on these is equally as important to the academic learning. Setting goals and monitoring progress towards those goals can also help to motivate students during their learning. Students need to see how the work will relate to their needs. That helps with the self-regulation aspect. Be aware of the progress in smaller steps, particularly if they're struggling, and see that they are changing and they are growing in their learning, and that is motivating to the end result, particularly for students with learning difficulties who may have a long way to go to the end result of what they might consider to be a reader. In the previous webinar of this series, Howie Knopf also provided some key information on students who may have difficulties with both academic and behavior or motivation issues. So there are additional ideas there as well. Okay, let's look at some lessons. We'll look at the initial lesson, similar to what we did with the VCE, but these are a little more complex lessons, and how we can use the delivery elements and the cognitive processing elements to make them more intense for some students. The first lesson we're going to look at is one of those high impact areas of teaching students to generate questions about text. This is a way to monitor comprehension that's not just relying on the teacher to ask the questions and to monitor the comprehension for them. In this initial lesson, you see that you tell the students, you give the students a purpose for learning this, that asking questions about the passage during and after reading will help them check their understanding of what they'll read. You tell the students that they're going to read a passage and make questions after each section, and then the students go ahead and read that first section of the passage. And the teacher asks the students to then write a question that can be answered by reading the passage. Students then share their questions, and others in the instructional group provide the answers, so they can check to see if they were understanding that aspect of it. Now let's consider some ways that we could modify this lesson if there are students who are struggling or who may struggle to be successful with that initial lesson. As teachers get to know their students, they can often anticipate delivery aspects of the lesson that are going to have to be intensified across the board in order to help students accelerate their learning. So they may be doing this ahead of time, or they may have thought it was explicit and systematic enough and had enough opportunities, thought it was intense enough, and then determined that a student was struggling and needs to find a way to make it more intensive. Let's look at this modified lesson piece by piece. The modified lesson starts off similarly, providing the rationale for the lesson. So this was, already there. Tell students that asking questions about a passage during and after reading will help them check their understanding of what they read. However, the initial lesson was missing instruction in how to generate questions. It jumped straight to practice. Read that section and write a question. One place to modify is to add instruction with an eye for more explicit and more systematic instruction. So let's look at what that could be. So here we're going to add a model, which is right away a place to make it certainly more explicit. We see there's a model, the teacher is to model creating a question that can be answered by using information found right there in the passage. And that's in quotes because it's also been made more systematic by breaking it into smaller steps. Here, the teacher is going to provide a model to make the steps for generating a question explicit for the students. And in addition, one type of question is introduced at a time. Rather than any type of question, they're going to do right there questions, which is basically a literal question. So it's a question where the answer can be found in text in one place, which is right there, so they can actually point to it, to allow students to practice and understand the explicit steps for generating different types of questions they're going to learn one at a time. And this progresses then on to questions that require some synthesis. The answer is in the text, but it's in multiple places in the text, and the students have to bring that together. And to then monitoring their comprehension by generating questions that are inferential in nature, that require not only the text, but some background knowledge as well. And so students can master each step or each type of question before moving on to the next one. It's a way to make that lesson more systematic by breaking it into smaller steps. Then you see students identify information, in this case the teacher, because the model is going on. They identify information from the text and turn it into a question. Teacher is going to use a think aloud because it's a very cognitive process to come up with that question. The way to make it more overt is to use the think aloud. There's a lot of information about Cam finding the gold ring. I think that might be important. So I'll make a right there question. The text tells right there where the gold ring was found. I'll make a question about that to be sure that I can remember. And you see there that the teacher is also modeling. We want to make questions about things that are important. Think Aloud can provide explicit instruction for students regarding what they should think about when they're completing this task. Making a question is difficult for me, the teacher continues on. I have to remember that I'm starting with the answer or the important information, and then I have to consider what question would have that answer. Okay, I can do this. And then comes up with the questions, points out using a question word, which might be something from previous learning that the students have done. That's also a place where it could be made even more explicit and systematic. Maybe stems are given to help students come up with their questions. This is a continual dynamic process. You can take any lesson and make it more intensive using these delivery options. So you see in that model, though, there was also a model of self-talk, reminding students to use that self-regulation technique when they work through the task. That's part of the cognitive processing. And then the teacher is going to engage students in the model and instruction. Students have to identify the answer in text to make explicit the key feature of the right there question. Have students find the answer. So the teacher modeled how to generate the question and used to think aloud for that, but students know how to answer it, so you can get them engaged very quickly so that it's not all teacher talk. They haven't had all the instruction for how to generate the question, so engagement is with this kind of review area. Here, students identify the answer in the text to make explicit the key feature of the right there question. They can even point to where that answer is right there. In addition, because this is a complex task, several models to help students understand how to complete the new task are provided. So you see continue with other sections of the text, modeling several questions for the students so that they can see the variety even within a right there question. Then we see students are going to move into initial practice after several models. This is, again, much more step-by-step than that initial lesson. So the students work in partner groups to select one section of text and then generate one right there question. Now remember, this is already a small group. We're talking about maybe 2 partners in this group. Have partners share their question with the group and allow other students in the group to answer the question. Have students determine whether the question is truly a right there question and state why, and provide feedback as necessary. The teacher can hear both of the groups as they are working, both of the partners as they are working, and provide feedback during that time. There's the support of the partner in this initial practice, just gradually moving to students being able to do this on their own. Let's take a look at a second lesson. This is the Multisyllabic Words lesson that I referenced a little bit earlier, because teaching students a strategy, students who have already mastered initial phonics levels and are able to read single-syllable words, even 2-syllable words with their decoding abilities, need to move on then to larger words as they access more text that have many syllables. And the best way to read words with many syllables is actually not to sound out each of the sounds. So a high impact area can be to teach students a strategy for how to work with multisyllabic words. Many students who don't need intensive intervention often don't know how to attack these words. This is certainly an aspect that is sometimes part of core instruction too, but we can make it in an intensive form to help students who are struggling with reading. We're going to take a look at the second lesson. This is often, as part of core instruction, would often be a part of 3rd or 4th grade instruction. And the initial lesson suggests that students should use their knowledge. They've been learning affixes, which helps with multisyllabic words, and that they should look for affixes they know and look for base words they know to figure out words. So they should look for dis and the base word of trust and the affix of full to figure out that that's just trustful. And then the teacher writes napkin and department on the board, asking students to look for those parts that they know and then asking them to read the whole word, and students practice with several words. Now, implicitly, there is a strategy in there. I mean, certainly they're looking for known affixes and they're looking for known word parts like base words, but it's not very explicitly stated. So some students who need more intensive intervention are going to need that lesson intensified for them and made more explicit and systematic. Let's consider how we could do that if we knew that a student was in need of that more intensive intervention. The lesson, including the initial lesson, does have review of prerequisite skills. We're talking about the affixes that they've learned and looking for word parts that they know or base words that they know. In addition to that, they've also learned in this more intensive intervention that they can break words apart by looking for the syllables. And how do you do that if you don't already know what the word is? You certainly can't clap the syllables if you don't already know what the word is. But every syllable has one vowel sound, and so students are taught that, and then they can look at a word and find the vowel sound. Now, sometimes the vowel sound is two vowels together, like EA says E. Sometimes it's a single letter. Each syllable will have one vowel sound that is together. The only time that it's not together is if it's the silent E, and it's sort of that VCE vowel sound, but otherwise they're right next to each other. So students have already had practice with that. That was already one way to make this more intensive in their previous instruction. That allows them to look at this strategy. So the initial lesson had instruction and support for students to read the words, but this modified lesson makes those steps more explicit for the students. So here you see a step-by-step process for reading multisyllabic words that is provided to the students. We'll teach each part of it, and they can generalize that. They learn it once, and they can generalize it to any of the multisyllabic words they come across. First, they're going to find the vowels in the words. They're looking for a way to break that word apart. That allows them to identify the general syllables or word parts, and they look for ones that they know, and they pronounce that, each part. That includes the known affixes, that includes base words, that includes word parts that they know have a closed or an open syllable if they've learned that aspect of it. And then they combine each of those word parts to form the word, just as was done in the initial lesson, but not quite as explicitly. Breaking this process into steps can make the process more manageable for students with significant needs by providing a scaffold for completing the task. So then the explicit instruction with modeling is provided. So you notice that the teacher includes the step-by-step process. So they go through, you don't just teach these 4 steps and then kind of do it implicitly. They're going to go through each of those 4 steps and reinforce how to think about the process with that. When you see a long word, these are the steps you follow to read it. Look at this word and point to napkin, which was one of the words in the initial lesson. First, I'm going to find the vowels in the word. I'm going to underline each vowel. Since 2 vowels are separated by consonants, there will probably be 2 syllables, the A and the I, and that means that we've got 2 syllables there. Then they go on to the second step they learned. So second, I look for syllables or word parts I know. There's the word nap at the beginning. I know that, so I'm going to underline it. And I see a closed syllable at the end of the word. I'll underline that too. And students who know about closed syllables know that they have the short I sound. Then you go on to step 3. Next, I say each syllable based on the syllable type and using the sounds I know. The first syllable is nap because it's a closed syllable and has a short vowel sound. And because the second syllable is a closed syllable, it also has a short vowel sound, so that's kin. Nap, kin. And last, I combine the syllables to form the word. Napkin makes napkin. Point to each syllable as it's said, and then the teacher slides the finger under the whole word, putting it together into a word. So there will be multiple models going through each of those first steps. First, finding the vowels. Second, looking for the syllables or word parts they know. Third, saying those. And fourth, combining it into a word. Then the teacher will slowly turn the task over to the students by providing scaffolding during initial practice to assist students in remembering the step-by-step process for reading the multisyllabic words. So we're going to keep that strategy really overt for students and help them with that. The initial lesson really jumped quickly from here's how you can kind of look for parts that you know and put them together. Okay, now you try it. And for many students, that's enough. But for students who need intensive interventions, it needs to be much more broken down and much more explicit. As we look at this, I want you to consider the support that the teacher is providing versus the aspects that the students are now taking over. Let's read the next word. They've now moved on to the next word department, which was in that initial lesson. First, you find the vowels. There are 3 vowels to underline, and then the students do that. They underline those vowels. The teacher then also does it so they can get immediate feedback on how they underlined it. They can compare it to her model or his model. Then next, we look for syllables or word parts we know. Underline each word part, and the teacher thinks aloud, well, it has D at the beginning. That's a prefix that we've learned. And I see a word I know, part, in the middle. And it looks like there's a closed syllable at the end. So they obviously haven't learned the affix meant in this case. That's underlined for the students to see, and they can do it as well. Next, we're going to say each syllable, asking the students to say the syllables as I point to each one. Point to the DE, the students say what that is because they have already learned that affix. They say what the middle part is, and they found out the last part. Last, combine the syllables to form the words. So the students say department, department. And that can obviously be connected as well with their vocabulary instruction if they don't know the meaning of department. Here you see the teacher slowly fades the scaffolding. There was quite a bit of scaffolding in that previous slide to allow students to take on more of the process independently. They've got a sheet with a grid on it and a bunch of different multisyllabic words on it. They've made it into a little bit of game. The student picks a grid coordinate like B2, and the teacher writes the word from square B2 on the board. Students on their own apply the strategy. They have to underline the vowels first and the syllables on their worksheet. Then they have to tell the teacher how they would mark it up, so it can be marked up on the model, which also provides immediate feedback to everybody before they try to read the word. Then they say the parts of the word, and then they say the whole word. So you can quickly move to this. And we're going to fade the overt parts of that strategy as they go, too, as they become more fluent with this. They're going to think about where the vowels are and the word parts that they know, but they won't have to overtly underline them. And you can slowly fade that. But they will be successful with each step of this. That's how we'll know it's explicit and systematic enough. Today, we discussed an architecture for intensifying interventions. Alone or in combination, reading interventions in the elementary grades can be intensified by changing the organization of the intervention. So we talked about additional time and reducing group size and key aspects of that. They can also be intensified by considering how to target specific content, thinking about the students' strengths and weaknesses and where they specifically need intervention, and really importantly, considering where the highest impact is to target instruction. Or they can be intensified, and that's an and/or, I guess, by providing exacting delivery of instruction to meet student needs. How can we make it more explicit, more systematic? Where can we increase student response and practice opportunities? Where can we provide better, more precise, and more immediate feedback? And are there self-regulation strategies that would help with the efficiency of their learning? These, as I've said, can be used in combination. You may want to add additional time and organizational aspect, target a little bit better some of the high impact skills in the intervention, and in addition, make it more explicit and systematic. So there's several of these that can be used together. That concludes the presentation aspect of today's webinar, and I'm going to throw it back to our question and answer session.
Great. Thank you, Jeannie. Oh, that was amazing. That was so much information there. Well, we've had dozens and dozens of questions come in, so let's get started. All right, the first question is we're gonna kind of pull up to a higher level here. And as a country, we've spent billions and billions of dollars and have invested in a huge array of interventions and other resources that promise to get our students reading at grade level. So are we making any progress?
Well, yes. Overall, reading achievement actually at the elementary level has risen over the years, and likely not only because of this research, but because of getting this research into practice in many classrooms. The average reading of students on measures like oral reading fluency or the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the reading comprehension, have risen in the elementary grades. And that's what we would expect given this research, first of all, largely being at the elementary level, but also in terms of the timing of it. We would expect to see the improvements there, that students are getting this more improved instruction from the time that they enter school. Our improved reading instruction in the classroom, as well as providing early interventions, is likely also responsible for these increases. Using materials and programs, of which there are many, there's no one perfect program, with evidence-based practices is key to maintaining these gains.
Great. Well, that's good to hear. It's very encouraging. So we've had a bunch of questions from people about older students. So how do these strategies apply with older students?
Sure. The strategies for intensifying interventions apply really to any intervention level. So the concepts that we talked about today are actually across content too. They are ways to intensify instruction. Many of the examples I shared for what it looks like at the elementary level, since that was our focus today. However, many middle and high school students are reading at the elementary level, and the examples that I shared, particularly word recognition, multisyllabic word reading, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, they all apply to older students with these difficulties. In addition, all of the effective delivery components that we discussed apply to any age level or reading component, including reading comprehension. And students with significant reading difficulties at the middle or high school level often need intervention in multiple components of reading to improve their reading comprehension. They may struggle with reading words in print, so phonics and word recognition is still important, and that's the reason that they can't comprehend the text. In addition, they may struggle with the fluency of reading print, which makes it difficult for them to focus on the deep meaning of the text because they spend a lot of time changing that print into language and using their resources for that. So strategies for continuing to work on fluency are important. They may not have the stamina to keep up with the comprehension of long passages at the slow rate that they're reading. And of course, as they get older, those passages get longer. They may also have a weakness in vocabulary or background knowledge that affects their reading comprehension. This may even be partially due to how little text they've been able to read through the years compared to their peers who don't have significant reading difficulties. And of course, they may need specific intervention in how to gain meaning from complex text and the actual comprehension instruction. So students whose reading difficulties progress into the middle or high school levels often need very intensive multi-component reading interventions that span several years of development to achieve more success in reading. The interventions can be made more intense using the techniques that we discussed today.
Well, that is great. That could be a whole future webinar in and of itself. Okay, so we've had a number of questions about how do we go about choosing the most effective reading interventions?
Sure, and I know some of those questions related to specific programs as well. So it's important to examine reading interventions for evidence-based reading instruction prior to purchasing them, no question, when we're talking about materials or programs. This includes looking at the program's content coverage as well as the implementation and delivery of individual lessons throughout the program. You can use many of the areas that we did discuss today. So does the program have a focus on high-impact areas of instruction? Is there explicit and systematic instruction? Are there ample practice opportunities and opportunities for immediate feedback? We would look at the lessons to examine that. And then no matter what the program is, when we're talking about students who need something intensive, we can then apply the areas that we discussed today even within that program. But it is nice to be able to start with an evidence-based program and not have to create everything from scratch and just focus on the intensity parts. In addition to that, the National Center of Intensive Interventions, which has a website, and the What Works Clearinghouse also has a website. They provide information on reading intervention programs and the research base that is behind them, which is a great place to start so you don't have to do all the work yourself. Their summary reports are available free on their websites, and I understand people will be getting a resource guide, and those websites are on there.
Well, great. So we have questions about MTSS, and maybe you can explain what it is and how does this help motivate students to read?
Sure. So MTSS is multi-tiered systems of support, and so it's a tiered system, somewhat similar to RTI, but it's just focusing on the instruction part, not necessarily focusing on any particular identification of students. It's a systematic way of providing high-quality instruction and interventions to students according to their needs. It includes frequent progress monitoring, and instructional changes based on student needs and based on that progress monitoring, and early intervention as soon as students demonstrate needs so that they can get on track as quickly as possible.
Okay, great. So here's a good one, and this is related to older students as well in some ways. So when did kids stop learning to read and shift to reading to learn?
Sure. Well, kids never really stop learning to read, at least not in the sort of K-12 realm. With each grade level, the text gets more complex and it covers more content areas. As a result, students need to receive explicit reading instructions throughout the grade levels to address the higher level reading skills that are needed by adolescents to actively engage in, read, and understand a variety of complex texts. Successful acquisition of early literacy skills, typically taught in kindergarten through third grade, does not necessarily provide students with all of the necessary skills that are needed to remain proficient readers in the upper grades, and that's why this reading instruction needs to continue. As for reading to learn, this is really about comprehension, and so even students in the early grades, as well as students in the upper grades, read to learn new things. That is the purpose of reading.
Well, that's certainly why I read. Okay, what preparation and resources are needed so gen ed teachers are able to help students with disabilities?
Sure, or many students with disabilities are in the general education classroom for various parts of their day, or maybe most of their day. Special education teachers are the specialists in instruction, and so they need very specific training in the principles of effective instruction and how to intensify and adapt that instruction to students' needs. And so in this way, they can provide for students in general education classrooms and collaborate with general education teachers the knowledge for helping all students acquire the content that the general education teacher is trying to teach. Special education teachers also need specialized training in what intervention students need in order to be able to access the content in the general education classroom. And so sometimes there are interventions that are very specific to a student or a group of students with disabilities that are not part of the grade level content that students do need to receive, or they won't be able to access the grade level content. And so having specialized training in those interventions and being able to implement those interventions will help students with disabilities in their general education classrooms.
Okay, well, we've gotten some questions about dyslexia. So what are the best strategies and interventions for those students with dyslexia?
Sure. Well, dyslexia is a specific learning disability, so it's not completely separate from what we've been talking about today. It's characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition, and that can, of course, affect the student's comprehension or vocabulary development. The difficulties often result from a deficit in the phonological component of language, so that becomes an important area to provide explicit instruction and intervention in. The strategies we discussed today are evidence-based strategies for reading intervention, including in these phonological areas. So for a student with dyslexia, these strategies would be particularly applied in what we talked about related to phonological awareness, phonics and word recognition, and or fluency components of reading. As well as many students, depending on where they are in school and what intervention they've gotten and their success rate with that, they may have secondary consequences like reading comprehension or vocabulary that they still need intervention in.
All right, questions about Tier 2 and is there a criteria for what students should be in Tier 2? And what's the most effective and productive way to do Tier 2 to see progress?
Yeah, so as we talked about at the very beginning of the webinar, Tier 2 intervention really refers to a level of intervention, not a difference in evidence-based instruction. So Tier 2 is most often the first intervention that a student may receive if they are identified either as being at risk for reading difficulties early on, or if they're not on grade level expectations in reading. And the goal is to provide additional targeted instruction so the student can accelerate their learning and benefit better from the Tier 1 or the core classroom reading instruction. Therefore, as we discussed in today's webinar, Tier 2 instruction is supplemental small group reading instruction that addresses the major components of reading and builds foundational skills as they are needed by the student. It should be systematic, highly explicit, and highly interactive for the student to get those additional opportunities for practice. Student progress should be monitored so that the instructional changes can be made to accelerate learning, to be able to close that gap to grade level expectations as needed. And any decisions about the need for more intensive interventions, of course, need to be monitored with that progress monitoring as well. And then that's more of a Tier 3 intervention, as we discussed today, can be determined what the student needs in that area.
All right, thanks for that. We get questions about RTI students and them being added to the special education workload. So how is that supposed to work?
Sure. So I assume that this is referring to students with reading difficulties who do not have an identified disability. RTI is more of a process than a particular student, but I'm assuming it's referring to general education students who are showing reading difficulties who perhaps need an intervention, and some of them may even need intensive interventions and perhaps are being added to the instruction that special education teachers are doing. So there is the possibility of using some special education funds for general education to prevent students from falling so far behind due to lack of good instruction or intervention that they start to begin to look like they have a disability even though they probably don't. And so those funds are available to make sure that really good evidence-based interventions are being implemented early. But in terms of caseloads, the special education teacher should be an instructional specialist that has the knowledge for providing the most intensive interventions for students with disabilities. And there may be some students who do not have a disability that also require very intensive interventions, but that's going to be a fairly small number of students. And it may be appropriate to have these students attend instructional groups of intensive interventions that the special education teacher is already providing to meet the needs of the students with disabilities. If their needs are similar, it certainly makes sense that they could get instruction in that group. But there's no question that students in special education need to receive specialized intensive intervention with a special education teacher, and their needs need to be met as part of their IEPs. And if there are many, many students who do not have a disability and are demonstrating the need for very intensive interventions, that would suggest a problem more in either the Tier 1 instruction or the Tier 2 less intensive intervention levels if there's so many students not responding to those. So it really depends on where the difficulty is occurring.
Well, speaking of different kinds of specialists, so are these methods that you described for reading specialists, and where do SLPs fit into all this?
Sure. So intensive multi-component reading interventions incorporate instruction in each of the areas we talked about, in phonological awareness, in phonics and word recognition, fluency, vocabulary and oral language, and in reading and listening comprehension. And they are typically implemented by special education teachers or reading specialists. But some students may also have intensive language needs that are on their IEPs, and that include time with a speech-language pathologist. The IEP goals most related to the types of reading interventions we talked about today are those in oral language and in phonological awareness. And so SLPs provide instruction in these areas, and certainly coordination with the reading interventionist if a student is receiving services in both areas would definitely be beneficial.
How about for our English language learner students? Are there special considerations, especially for those that have learning disabilities as well as being ELL?
Yeah, so we certainly have a number of students with disabilities who are ELs, and that has been largely understudied, the combination of those two things. There's much research on English language learning, and there's much research on students with disabilities, but there are fewer studies on students who have both a learning disability and are an English language learner. A recent synthesis by Scott Baker et al., which is available free on the web. It was published in 2014. It revealed about 15 studies across both elementary and secondary grades that were high-quality studies, according to the What Works Clearinghouse. And students with disabilities who are also ELs in this research definitely require, not surprisingly, additional attention to their language needs. ELs often have particular difficulty in acquiring content area knowledge due to inadequate relevant background knowledge and unfamiliarity with the academic language that's largely used in schools, or discourse skills, of course. So oral and written language instruction that is integrated in content area teaching and targeted instruction in academic vocabulary have been identified as two key recommendations with a strong research base behind them for improving outcomes for ELs. Specific to students with disabilities who are also ELs is a recommendation for targeting vocabulary and targeting background knowledge, as well as teaching them active use of cognitive strategies such as summarizing, clarifying, or generating questions to facilitate discourse and dialogue, to facilitate their use of vocabulary and their engagement in learning as a result.
All right, well, we have time for just one more question, and then we'll wrap up after that. And for those of you out there listening, please hang in there. If you want to get credit for this webinar, be sure to stay with us and complete the self-assessment and feedback survey at the end. So the last question is, what's the connection between writing skills and reading?
Yes, I saw a few questions related to the writing aspect. So reading and writing are foundational skills for academic achievement across content areas, and many tasks in and out of school require both reading and writing. So reading and writing certainly are related, and they are built on similar language and cognitive foundations. In reading, the primary task is to read or decode a printed text or a written text and comprehend it, understand it. And therefore, at a minimum, reading requires word reading and language comprehension. In writing or written composition, one has to generate content, translate it into oral language, and then produce it in print. So it's sort of the opposite process. And in the earliest grades, the greatest overlap is probably in the foundational skills of decoding, on the one hand, reading words, and spelling. So sort of an encoding, if you will, where you have to think of the sounds of the letters and then put them into print. And for the earliest students, the earliest grades, their writing and their reading are very similar in terms of the decoding and spelling. But as students progress in reading and writing with more complex texts, there's also overlap in a discourse sense. So reading comprehension on the reading side, or written composition on the writing side. And those discourse aspects are really a complex set of skills that include vocabulary, include background knowledge, include grammatical knowledge, which can help both with your reading comprehension as well as your written composition, and also include inferencing skills and perspective taking. So there's quite a bit of overlap, but certainly it is almost an opposite process, creating print versus turning print into understanding.
Well, that is all we have time for today. Thank you, Jeannie, so much for being here and for being part of Presence Learning's Blueprint for Success series, where we're exploring ways to build strong foundations for academic success. So thank you so much. And a big thanks to our audience. If you want to go back and take a second listen or look at any of this practical advice on reading interventions, you'll be able to find a recording of this webinar on our website, along with other presentations and a whole archive of great content. We'll also be sending out a link to the recording after this webinar, so everybody will receive that as well. You'll also get a link to the resource guide, so keep an eye out for that. And please feel free to share these resources with anybody, any of your colleagues that you think would be beneficial for. Finally, please mark your calendars for our final presentation in our Blueprints for Success series on November 30th. Dr. Carol Tomlinson will be joining us to discuss the applications and outcomes of differentiated instruction. She is one of the most sought-after advocates for learning environments on this planet, so please do not miss it and tell your special ed colleagues. Again, that's November 30th. Okay, so if you're a school psychologist and you're looking for a flexible work schedule, we invite you to join Presence Learning as part of our network as an independent contractor. Visit us at plearn.co/join for more information. Or if your school is looking for a school psychologist, speech-language pathologist, or OT to perform assessments or therapy and provide services to your students, email us at schools@presencelearning.com to hear more about what we can offer. If you'd like a certificate for today's webinar, stay online, complete the short self-assessment and feedback survey. You'll receive your certificate within a few hours, and it contains all the information you need to self-report your professional development participation, so please hang on to that. If you've requested CEUs from ASHA, we will report your information to ASHA, but it can take 6 to 8 weeks for this course to show up on your transcript.